The first rays of sunlight stretched across the towering pine forests of Yellowstone National Park, painting the morning mist in shades of gold. A cool breeze carried the scent of damp earth after a night of rain, while birds filled the quiet wilderness with cheerful songs. Park Ranger Daniel Brooks drove his green National Park Service pickup slowly along Patrol Route 7, one hand resting on the steering wheel and the other holding a steaming cup of coffee. Beside him sat Max, his 6-year-old German Shepherd and trusted patrol partner. For nearly 3 years, they had worked together almost every day. Max wasn't an official K-9 officer, but everyone in the park knew his reputation. His sharp instincts had helped locate lost hikers, detect small wildfires before they spread, and even warn rangers about dangerous wildlife hidden deep in the forest. Daniel smiled at his loyal companion. "Looks peaceful today, buddy." Max looked out the passenger window calmly, watching the endless rows of pine trees slip by. Everything felt normal, until it wasn't. Without warning, Max's ears snapped upright. His nose twitched. He inhaled deeply several times before standing on the seat. Daniel glanced toward him. "What is it?" Instead of answering with his usual quiet whine, Max stared toward the dense forest on the left side of the road. A low growl rumbled from deep inside his chest. Daniel immediately slowed the truck. Years of working together had taught him one important lesson. Max never reacted without a reason. The truck rolled forward another 100 feet. Then Max exploded into frantic barking. "Woof! Woof! Woof!" He scratched repeatedly at the passenger door, his entire body tense. Daniel pulled onto the shoulder and switched off the engine. "Easy, boy. Show me." The moment the door opened, Max jumped to the ground and sprinted into the woods. He didn't follow the hiking trail. Instead, he pushed through thick bushes, weaving between towering pines with complete confidence. Daniel grabbed his backpack, flashlight, radio, and first aid kit before hurrying after him. Max slowed down. The German Shepherd never looked back. Every few yards, he lowered his nose to the ground, following an invisible scent before changing direction again. Daniel knew exactly what Max was doing. He had picked up a fresh trail. After nearly 10 minutes of hiking through increasingly dense forest, Daniel noticed they had entered an area rarely visited by tourists. The trees stood closer together. Fallen branches covered the ground. No footprints. No campsite. No signs of recent visitors. Suddenly, Max stopped. His body became perfectly still. Then he barked again, louder than before. Daniel hurried forward. Hidden beneath tangled vines and thick brush stood an old white cargo truck. Nature had almost swallowed it. Branches rested across the roof. Leaves covered the hood. Mud nearly concealed the license plate. Both rear tires were flat. The truck looked abandoned. Daniel frowned. How did this get out here? No public road led to this part of the forest. Someone had driven the vehicle deep into Yellowstone on purpose. Max refused to move away. He stood beside the rear cargo doors, barking relentlessly. The fur along his back stood straight up. Daniel slowly circled the vehicle. The driver's door was slightly open. Inside, the cab was empty. No driver. No wallet. No registration papers. Only a few empty water bottles and muddy boot prints on the floor. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Daniel Brooks. I've located an abandoned cargo truck approximately 1 mile north of Patrol Route 7. I'm checking the vehicle now." The dispatcher answered immediately. "Copy that, Ranger Brooks. Use caution and keep us updated." Daniel clipped the radio back onto his vest. Just as he turned toward the rear of the truck, Max suddenly stopped barking. The silence felt almost unnatural. Daniel frowned. "What is it?" He stepped closer to the cargo doors. For a moment, he heard nothing. Then, a faint sound drifted through the thick metal walls. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an engine. It was soft, weak, almost impossible to hear. It sounded like several frightened animals crying somewhere inside the truck. Daniel's expression instantly changed. Someone or something was trapped in there. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and examined the heavy padlock securing the cargo doors. It was old, rusty. but still locked. Max sat directly in front of it, staring at Daniel with urgent eyes as if begging him to act before it was too late. Daniel took a slow breath, then reached for the lock. He had no way of knowing that opening those cargo doors would uncover one of the largest wildlife trafficking operations Yellowstone had ever seen. Daniel rested one hand on the heavy padlock while Max remained perfectly still beside him. The German Shepherd no longer barked. Instead, his eyes stayed fixed on the cargo doors, his body tense with anticipation. The faint cries came again. This time, Daniel was certain. Something alive was trapped inside. He quickly radioed dispatch. "Dispatch, I have possible live animals inside an abandoned cargo truck. I'm forcing entry." The reply came almost immediately. "Copy that, Ranger Brooks. Backup is on the way. ETA 20 minutes. Daniel looked at the thick lock. 20 minutes was too long. Whatever was inside sounded weak. He grabbed a tire iron from the truck's toolbox and wedged it beneath the rusty padlock. After several hard pulls, crack. The lock snapped open and fell to the ground. Daniel slowly pulled one of the cargo doors. The old hinges groaned loudly. A wave of stale, humid air rolled out. The smell hit him instantly. It wasn't the smell of gasoline or chemicals, it was the smell of frightened animals that had been trapped without fresh air for days. Max rushed forward but stopped just inside the doorway. He didn't jump. He simply stared into the darkness. Daniel switched on his flashlight. Its bright beam swept across the cargo compartment. Wooden crates. Dozens of them. Some large, some barely bigger than a suitcase. Each crate had small ventilation holes drilled into the sides. From several of them came soft, scratching sounds. Daniel's stomach tightened. No. He stepped farther inside. One crate suddenly shook, then another. Max walked directly toward the smallest crate near the front wall. He sniffed it carefully before looking back at Daniel. The cries were coming from inside. Daniel knelt and examined the lid. Heavy nails had been driven into the wood. Using the tire iron, he carefully pried the first board loose. The tiny opening widened. A frightened pair of golden eyes looked back at him. It was a young, bald eagle. The bird was badly dehydrated. Its feathers were dirty, and one wing trembled as it tried to move. Daniel's heart sank. "It's okay. You're safe now." He slowly lifted the weak bird from the crate and wrapped it inside his ranger jacket. The eagle was barely able to keep its eyes open. Max sat quietly beside it, watching every movement. Daniel continued opening the remaining crates. Inside one, 2 river otter pups curled together in fear. Another held 3 red fox kits, too exhausted even to stand. A larger crate contained 2 great horned owls with leather straps securing their wings. Several more crates held rare reptiles packed into small plastic containers with almost no room to move. Every animal looked frightened. Most had gone without food or water for far too long. Daniel counted the crates. 23. His chest tightened. This isn't someone's illegal pet collection. This is organized wildlife trafficking. He grabbed his radio again. "Dispatch, upgrade this to a major wildlife crime scene. I have multiple protected species inside the vehicle." There was a brief pause before the dispatcher answered. "Understood, Ranger Brooks. Federal Wildlife Service has been notified." Daniel carefully handed water to the eagle, using the cap of his canteen. The bird drank only a few drops before closing its eyes again. Max suddenly raised his head. His ears pointed toward the forest. A low growl escaped his throat. Daniel immediately looked outside. The woods were silent. Too silent. He slowly stepped out of the truck. Nothing. Only towering pines moving gently in the breeze. Then, a fresh boot print caught his attention. It wasn't covered by fallen leaves. The soil around it was still damp. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. Daniel followed the tracks a few yards before stopping. The prints disappeared into thick undergrowth. He looked around carefully. Whoever had abandoned the truck couldn't have gone far. Behind him, Max barked sharply once. Daniel turned. The German Shepherd wasn't looking at the truck anymore. He was staring deep into the forest. His nose lifted into the wind, then he began moving forward with quiet determination. Daniel recognized that look immediately. Max had found a new scent, and this time, he wasn't tracking animals. He was tracking the people who had left them behind. Max moved through the forest without hesitation, his nose close to the ground. Daniel followed only a few steps behind, careful not to lose sight of him. The trail was fresh. Broken fern leaves still glistened with morning dew. A few branches had been snapped recently, leaving pale wood exposed beneath the bark. Whoever had abandoned the truck hadn't been gone long. Daniel spoke quietly into his radio. "Dispatch, I'm following fresh tracks, approximately 1 mile northeast of the abandoned vehicle. Proceed carefully," the dispatcher replied. "Additional rangers are 10 minutes away." Daniel acknowledged the message, but kept moving. Max suddenly stopped beside a muddy patch near a narrow creek. He sniffed the ground several times before looking toward Daniel. "What did you find?" Daniel knelt beside him. Several boot prints crossed the creek. There were at least 3 different sets. Beside them were fresh tire tracks from a small all-terrain vehicle. The smugglers hadn't walked away. They had escaped using an ATV. Daniel photographed every footprint before continuing. The trail climbed a rocky hillside covered with pine trees. After another 15 minutes, Max slowed down. His ears lifted. A faint mechanical sound echoed through the trees. Daniel immediately crouched behind a fallen log. The sound grew louder. Then it stopped. He carefully looked ahead. About 100 yards away stood an old wooden hunting cabin. Its roof was weathered. Most of its windows were broken. From a distance, it appeared abandoned. But Daniel noticed something strange. A thin stream of gray smoke drifted from the chimney. Someone was inside. Max stared silently at the cabin. Daniel whispered, "Good boy." He raised a pair of binoculars. The front porch was empty. No vehicles, no movement. Yet the smoke continued rising into the cool morning air. Daniel quietly circled toward the back of the cabin. Halfway there, Max suddenly froze. His head turned toward a cluster of bushes. Then he gave a low, warning growl. Daniel followed his gaze. Hidden beneath a camouflage tarp sat a green ATV. Its engine was still warm. He carefully touched the exhaust pipe. Someone had parked it only minutes earlier. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. The smugglers were close. Very close. He radioed dispatch again. "I've located what appears to be a temporary base. Possible suspects still on scene." "Do not approach alone," dispatch answered immediately. "Backup is 5 minutes out." Daniel knew 5 minutes could feel like an eternity. Then, a loud bang came from inside the cabin, followed by angry voices. Max looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded. They moved closer. Staying hidden behind thick bushes, Daniel carefully peered through a cracked window. 3 men stood inside. One slammed his fist onto a table. "The truck's gone." Another man paced across the room. "Someone found it." The third picked up a map. "We leave now." Daniel quietly raised his phone and began recording. Every face, every word, every movement. The first man grabbed a backpack. "We'll move the rest of the animals tonight." Daniel's eyes widened. The rest, his heart sank. The truck wasn't carrying all of them. There were more animals somewhere nearby. Much more. Just then, Max's ears twitched. He turned toward the forest again. A weak sound drifted through the trees. It wasn't coming from the cabin. It came from farther uphill. A frightened cry. Daniel barely heard it, but Max had already identified it. The German Shepherd gently nudged Daniel's arm before looking toward the hill. Daniel understood immediately. The cabin distracted everyone, but the animals were somewhere else. He made a quick decision. Capturing the smugglers could wait a few more minutes. Saving living animals couldn't. Daniel whispered into the radio, "I've confirmed 3 suspects, but Max has located additional animals. I'm moving to rescue them." He quietly backed away from the cabin. Max immediately took the lead again. The cries became clearer with every step. After climbing another 200 yards, the forest suddenly opened into a hidden clearing. Daniel stopped. His eyes widened. Surrounded by camouflage netting stood more than a dozen large steel cages. Inside them were frightened wolves, young mountain lions, bobcats, and several injured bald eagles. Some animals lay weakly on the ground. Others paced nervously inside their cages. Daniel could hardly believe what he was seeing. This wasn't a small smuggling operation. It was an entire illegal wildlife prison hidden in the heart of Yellowstone. Max stepped closer to the nearest cage. One exhausted wolf slowly lifted its head. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, the terrified animal stopped trembling. Then Daniel heard footsteps behind him. Heavy footsteps. Someone had followed them. Daniel's pulse quickened. The footsteps were getting closer. Max immediately stepped in front of him, standing between his partner and the approaching sound. His ears stood tall, and a deep growl rumbled from his chest. Daniel slowly crouched behind a thick pine tree, keeping his eyes on the narrow trail leading into the clearing. A man appeared. He wore camouflage clothing and carried a large sack over one shoulder. A hunting rifle hung across his back. Without noticing Daniel or Max, he walked toward the steel cages. He stopped beside one holding two young wolves. "They'll pick you up tonight," he muttered. "Big money for both of you." Daniel quietly raised his phone and began recording the man's face, his voice, the cages, everything. The smuggler unlocked one cage and slid a bowl of dirty water inside. The frightened wolves backed away. Instead of showing concern, the man laughed. "You'll survive another day." Max's growl grew louder. Daniel gently placed a hand on the dog's shoulder. Not yet. They needed stronger evidence. The man continued checking the cages. Daniel counted them carefully. 14 large steel cages, 7 smaller transport crates, more than 30 animals. Some were native to Yellowstone. Others clearly weren't. There were young gray wolves, bobcats, foxes, bald eagles, hawks, river otters, and even 2 frightened lynxes. Several animals had tracking collars that had been crudely cut off. Daniel's heart sank. These weren't random captures. Many had been part of wildlife conservation programs. Someone had been stealing protected animals directly from the park. Just then, Daniel's radio vibrated silently. A text message from another ranger appeared. 2 minutes away. "Hold your position." Daniel took a slow breath. Almost there. The smuggler suddenly stopped walking. He looked toward the forest. His expression changed. Had he heard something? For several long seconds, he listened carefully. Max remained perfectly still. Not a sound. The man shrugged and turned back toward the cages. Daniel quietly exhaled. Then another voice echoed through the trees. Eric, a second smuggler, stepped into the clearing. He carried a clipboard. "The boss says we're leaving early." Eric frowned. "Why?" "The truck disappeared. I told you someone would find it." Daniel's eyes narrowed. So the abandoned truck had been only one shipment. The operation was much larger than anyone had imagined. The second man pointed toward the cages. "Load the eagles first. The buyer crosses the border tomorrow." Daniel tightened his jaw. These animals weren't being kept, they were being sold. Max suddenly lifted his head. A faint whimper came from the far corner of the clearing. Daniel followed the sound. Hidden beneath a tarp stood one final crate. Unlike the others, it wasn't made of steel. It was reinforced with thick wooden boards. The crate shook slightly. Something much larger was trapped inside. The second smuggler walked toward it. He kicked the side with his boot. Quiet. An angry growl answered from within. Daniel's stomach tightened. Whatever was inside was powerful. The man laughed. "Relax, you'll be worth a fortune." Daniel carefully zoomed his phone camera toward the crate. A faded warning label came into view. "Extreme caution." Another violent impact shook the wooden walls. Max stared at the crate without blinking. Daniel whispered, "What have they captured?" Before he could think further, police sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Both smugglers froze. Eric looked toward the forest. "They're here," the second man cursed. "Forget the cages. We're leaving." Both men ran toward the cabin. Daniel immediately grabbed his radio. "Move in." Within seconds, 3 National Park Service trucks burst through the trees from opposite directions. Uniformed rangers poured into the clearing. Federal rangers don't move. The smugglers sprinted into the forest. Without waiting for an order, Max shot forward like an arrow. Daniel ran after him. Branches whipped across his face as they disappeared between the towering pines. Behind them, other rangers began securing the terrified animals. Ahead, Max never slowed. His eyes remained locked on the fleeing smugglers. The chase through Yellowstone had begun. Max raced through the forest, his powerful legs carrying him effortlessly over fallen logs and rocky ground. Daniel stayed close behind, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Ahead, the 2 smugglers crashed through the undergrowth, desperately trying to escape before the rangers closed in. Federal Rangers, one officer shouted through a loudspeaker, "Stop where you are." Neither man slowed down. Instead, they split apart. One sprinted downhill toward a dry creek bed, while the other disappeared into dense pine trees. Daniel made a quick decision. "You take the one on the left," he called to another ranger. "I'm staying with Max." Max had already chosen his target. Without hesitation, he followed the man heading toward the creek. Fresh footprints marked the muddy ground. Broken branches pointed the way. The smuggler glanced over his shoulder. The moment he saw Max gaining on him, panic spread across his face. "Get away from me." He grabbed a thick stick from the ground and swung it wildly. Max never hesitated. He dodged the swing with remarkable speed and continued closing the distance. Daniel shouted, "Drop the weapon." The man ignored him. Instead, he jumped across the narrow creek and scrambled up the opposite bank. But in his rush, his foot landed on loose gravel. He slipped. His backpack slid several feet down the slope. Dozens of documents spilled across the ground. Maps, shipping invoices, foreign currency. Daniel reached the papers first, while Max continued watching the suspect. The smuggler tried to run again. Before he could take another step, Max leaped forward. With perfect control, he grabbed the man's jacket sleeve and pulled him off balance. The suspect crashed harmlessly onto the ground. Max immediately released his grip but stood directly in front of him, barking loudly. The man froze. He finally understood he wasn't getting away. Seconds later, 2 rangers arrived and secured him with handcuffs. Daniel picked up the scattered documents. One folded map caught his attention. Several locations inside Yellowstone had been marked with red circles. Beside each location was a handwritten date. Daniel frowned. These weren't random notes. They looked like scheduled pickup points. He unfolded another document. It listed dozens of protected animals. Each species had a price beside it. Young wolves, golden eagles, river otters, mountain lion cubs. Some prices reached tens of thousands of dollars. Daniel shook his head. "This operation is much bigger than we thought." His radio suddenly came alive. "Daniel, this is Ranger Collins. We've secured the clearing, but we've found something you need to see." "What is it?" There was a brief pause. Then Collins answered quietly, "We found another underground storage area." Daniel looked at Max. The German shepherd's ears immediately lifted. "Any animals inside?" Daniel asked. "We're not sure. We can hear movement, but the entrance is locked." Daniel didn't waste another second. "Stay where you are. We're coming." Within minutes, Daniel and Max were running back through the forest. The clearing was now filled with emergency vehicles. Wildlife veterinarians were treating the rescued animals, while federal officers photographed every cage. Ranger Collins waved Daniel toward a rocky hillside. Hidden beneath heavy camouflage netting was a pair of rusted steel doors built directly into the ground. They looked almost like the entrance to an old bunker. Faint scratching sounds echoed from somewhere below. Max stepped forward. He sniffed around the doors only once, then he looked directly at Daniel. His expression said everything. There were still living animals trapped inside. Daniel rested one hand on the cold steel handle. He slowly turned it. The door moved only a few inches before something inside let out a deep, powerful, terrifying roar. The roar echoed through the underground chamber. Every ranger instinctively stepped back. Even the experienced wildlife veterinarians exchanged nervous glances. Daniel tightened his grip on the steel door. What could be down there? No one answered. Max stood directly in front of the entrance, alert but calm. He wasn't barking. That told Daniel something important. Whatever was inside was frightened, not attacking. Let's open it slowly, Daniel said. 3 rangers pulled together. The heavy steel doors creaked open just enough for Daniel to shine his flashlight inside. A narrow staircase disappeared into darkness. The scratching sounds became louder. So did the deep breathing. Daniel descended carefully with Max at his side. The air was cool and damp. The underground room looked like an old military storage bunker that had been converted into an illegal holding facility. Steel cages lined both walls. Some were empty. Others still held terrified animals. Daniel's flashlight swept across the room. A pair of young black bears huddled together in one cage. Nearby, 2 mountain lion cubs trembled in fear. Several red foxes backed into the corners of their cages. Then the flashlight reached the far end of the bunker. Daniel stopped. Behind thick steel bars stood a massive adult grizzly bear. The bear was thin. Its fur was dirty. A heavy chain was fastened around one front leg. The animal let out another deep roar before collapsing onto the concrete floor. Daniel's expression changed immediately. It's exhausted. One veterinarian hurried over. She's badly dehydrated, and she's been sedated. Daniel slowly approached the cage. The grizzly lifted her head. For a brief moment, she looked directly at him. There was no anger in her eyes, only fear. Then she looked toward the opposite corner of the room and gave a soft, heartbreaking whine. Daniel followed her gaze. Behind a stack of wooden crates sat 2 tiny grizzly cubs. Both were alive. Both pressed tightly against each other. Max walked toward the cubs. He moved slowly, keeping his body low. The cubs didn't run. Instead, they watched him quietly. The mother bear stopped growling. She seemed to understand that Max wasn't a threat. Daniel smiled. She's worried about her babies. The veterinarians immediately began preparing tranquilizer equipment to move the bears safely. Just then, another ranger called from outside. Daniel, you need to see this. Daniel climbed back to the surface. Federal investigators had opened several metal filing cabinets hidden inside another room. One officer held up a thick binder. You were right. This wasn't just a local operation. Inside the binder were shipping records dating back nearly 5 years. Dozens of protected animals had been trafficked across state lines. Each shipment included buyers, payment records, and delivery routes. One investigator looked up. This network reaches far beyond Yellowstone. Daniel nodded slowly. We've only uncovered one location. There could be others. At that moment, Max emerged from the bunker. He walked directly toward a pile of discarded equipment near the trees. Then he stopped. His nose remained fixed on a weathered wooden crate. Daniel walked over. The crate looked empty, but Max refused to move. Daniel pried the lid open. Inside lay several satellite phones, GPS units, and a rugged laptop sealed inside a waterproof case. One federal agent carefully lifted the computer. If this still works, it could identify everyone involved. Daniel looked at Max and smiled. Another good catch. The German shepherd wagged his tail once. Then he turned toward the forest. In the distance, the sound of helicopter blades echoed across the mountains. More federal agents were arriving. The rescue operation was over, but the investigation was only beginning. By sunset, Yellowstone had become the center of a massive federal investigation. Park rangers, wildlife officers, and FBI agents worked side by side, documenting every piece of evidence recovered from the hidden camp. The rescued animals were carefully loaded into specialized transport trailers. Veterinarians moved from cage to cage, treating dehydration infections and injuries. Daniel stood beside the female grizzly as wildlife experts prepared to move her. She was awake now, though still weak. Her 2 cubs had already been placed in separate transport crates nearby. The moment they whimpered, the mother bear lifted her head and answered with a low, gentle rumble. Daniel smiled. They're going to make it. The lead veterinarian nodded. They were found just in time. Nearby, Max quietly watched the family. The cubs seemed unusually calm whenever he was close. One of the veterinarians laughed softly. "I've never seen frightened cubs relax around a dog before." Daniel scratched behind Max's ears. "He has a way of earning trust." Just then, Special Agent Melissa Carter approached with the rugged laptop recovered from the wooden crate. "We managed to power it on." Daniel looked up, and Melissa opened the screen. "What we found is unbelievable." Satellite images appeared one after another. Each showed a different location. Some were inside Yellowstone. Others were scattered across national forests in neighboring states. Every location had notes describing captured animals, delivery dates, and buyer information. "This wasn't just one smuggling ring," Melissa said. "It was an entire network." Daniel stared at the map. "If these sites are still active, there are more animals waiting to be rescued." Melissa nodded. "We're already sending teams." Before she could continue, another ranger hurried toward them. "Daniel, we found one more suspect." Everyone turned. Two officers were escorting a middle-aged man out of the woods. Unlike the others, he wasn't wearing camouflage. He looked well-dressed, almost like a businessman. Melissa's expression immediately changed. "I know who he is." Daniel frowned. "You do," she nodded. "He's the financial coordinator we've been tracking for nearly 2 years. The man looked at Daniel and smiled nervously. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Daniel remained calm. "I know enough." The suspect laughed. "You caught one camp. There are dozens more." Melissa stepped forward. "Not for long." She held up the laptop. "This belongs to us now." For the first time, the man's smile disappeared. He realized everything had been lost. Every payment, every contact, every secret. Max watched quietly as officers placed the suspect into a federal vehicle. Then he suddenly turned toward the transport trailer carrying the rescued animals. A weak, chirping sound came from inside. Daniel walked over. The young bald eagle he had rescued from the truck was awake. The bird blinked slowly before stretching one wing. The veterinarian smiled. "She's stronger already." Daniel opened the trailer door just enough for Max to look inside. The eagle stared at the German shepherd for several seconds. Then, surprisingly, she lowered her head calmly, almost as if she recognized him. Daniel smiled. "I think she knows who found her." As darkness settled over, Yellowstone helicopters lifted off one after another, carrying agents to the newly discovered locations. The operation was expanding faster than anyone had expected. Melissa looked toward Daniel. "This case will make national headlines." Daniel shook his head. "I don't care about headlines." He looked down at Max. "I just want every animal to make it home." Max wagged his tail once. For him. That had been the mission from the very beginning. 48 hours later, the investigation had spread far beyond Yellowstone. Using the data recovered from the smuggler's laptop, federal agents launched coordinated raids across 3 states. Every new operation uncovered the same pattern. Hidden camps, forged permits, protected wildlife packed into small cages waiting to be sold on the black market. By the end of the second day, more than 100 animals had been rescued. It quickly became one of the largest wildlife trafficking investigations in National Park Service history. Back in Yellowstone, the rescue center was busier than ever. Veterinarians worked around the clock treating every rescued animal before they could be returned to the wild. Daniel visited the center every morning before starting patrol. Max never left his side. The young bald eagle was recovering faster than anyone expected. Her feathers had been cleaned and she was eating on her own. Whenever Daniel entered the rehabilitation enclosure, Max quietly sat outside the fence. The eagle always turned toward him first. "She likes him," one veterinarian said with a smile. Daniel laughed. "I think she remembers who found her." Nearby, the 2 grizzly cubs had also grown stronger. Their mother had fully recovered from dehydration and was gradually regaining her strength. For the first time since her rescue, she stood confidently inside her large rehabilitation enclosure. When the cubs ran toward her, she gently nudged them with her nose. Watching the family reunite brought smiles to everyone at the center. A few days later, federal investigators held a press conference. News cameras from across the country gathered outside Yellowstone's visitor center. Special Agent Melissa Carter addressed the reporters. This investigation resulted in the rescue of more than 100 protected animals. 34 suspects have been arrested. We expect additional arrests as the investigation continues. One reporter raised a hand. What led investigators to the abandoned truck? Melissa smiled. A park ranger, she paused, and one extraordinary German shepherd. The cameras immediately turned toward Daniel and Max. Daniel looked uncomfortable standing in front of so many microphones. He simply rested one hand on Max's shoulder. The real heroes are the people who never gave up protecting these animals, he said. And Max reminded all of us to trust our instincts. The next morning, life slowly returned to normal inside the park. Tourists filled the hiking trails once again. Families stopped to thank Daniel after recognizing Max from the news. Children especially loved meeting the famous German shepherd. Max accepted every gentle pat with his usual calm personality. Late that afternoon, Daniel received wonderful news. The veterinarians had officially cleared the young bald eagle for release. He smiled. That's the best news I've heard all week. The release was scheduled for sunrise the following morning. Only a small group of rangers and wildlife specialists would attend. As the sun rose over Yellowstone, Daniel carefully opened the transport crate. The young eagle stepped onto the grass. She looked around for several seconds, then spread her powerful wings. For a brief moment, she remained perfectly still. Her eyes met Max's. The German shepherd quietly wagged his tail. With one powerful leap, the eagle lifted into the morning sky. She circled above the valley once, then twice, before soaring toward the distant mountains. Everyone watched in silence. Daniel smiled. Welcome home. Max continued watching until the eagle became nothing more than a tiny silhouette against the bright blue sky. The rescue mission had finally come to an end, but one final chapter still remained. There was one family waiting for the same chance to return home. The rescued grizzly mother and her 2 cubs were almost ready for release, and Daniel hoped Max would be there to watch them take their first steps back into the wild. A week after the final arrests, Yellowstone felt peaceful again. The rescue center was quieter. Most of the animals had recovered enough to be transferred back into protected habitats. Only one family remained, the female grizzly and her 2 cubs. Daniel walked toward their large enclosure just after sunrise. Max stayed close beside him. The mother bear looked healthier every day. Her thick brown coat had regained its shine, and she no longer limped when she walked. The cubs were full of energy, chasing each other through the grass and wrestling beneath fallen logs. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the lead wildlife veterinarian, greeted Daniel with a smile. I think today's the day. Daniel looked toward the bears. They're ready. She nodded. The mother is strong enough to survive on her own. The cubs have learned quickly. They belong back in the wild. Several rangers gathered near the transport trailer. Unlike most rescues, this release would take place deep inside a protected section of Yellowstone, far away from roads and visitors. An hour later, the convoy reached a quiet mountain valley surrounded by towering pines and open meadows. A clear stream flowed gently through the center of the valley. It was the perfect habitat. Daniel opened the rear gate of the trailer. No one moved. Everyone waited for a few long seconds. Nothing happened. Then the mother bear slowly stepped onto the grass. She paused and lifted her nose, breathing in the cool mountain air. The cubs quickly followed. At first, they stayed close to her. Then, curiosity took over. One wandered toward the stream. The other climbed onto a fallen tree. The mother bear watched patiently before leading them farther into the meadow. Daniel smiled. Their home. Max quietly sat beside him, watching the family disappear into the forest. Just before the bears reached the trees, the mother stopped. She turned around one last time. For several silent seconds, she looked directly at Daniel. Then, at Max. She gave a soft grunt. Not a warning, not a threat. Almost like a farewell. Then she disappeared into the wilderness with her cubs. The valley became quiet again. On the drive back, Daniel's phone rang. It was Special Agent Melissa Carter. I thought you'd like to know. Daniel smiled. The investigation, it's officially closed. She explained that the wildlife trafficking network had been completely dismantled. More than 40 suspects had been arrested. Several international buyers had also been identified. The evidence from that laptop changed everything, Melissa said. Daniel glanced at Max. No, he smiled. Max changed everything. Melissa laughed. I can't argue with that. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Max returned to their regular patrol route. The same road, the same forest, the same peaceful scenery where everything had begun. Daniel slowed the truck as they passed the place where the abandoned cargo truck had once been hidden. Now there was nothing left except fresh grass and wildflowers. Nature was already healing. So much has changed, Daniel said quietly. Max rested his head near the open window. A cool breeze carried the familiar scent of pine through the truck. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some missions ended with medals, others ended with something far more meaningful, because of one loyal dog who refused to ignore a strange scent in the forest. More than 100 wild animals had been saved. A dangerous criminal network had been destroyed. And Yellowstone had become a safer place for every creature that called it home. As the truck disappeared down the winding forest road, Daniel smiled at his faithful partner. You did good, buddy. Max looked back at him. His tail gave one slow content wag. For him, that was more than enough. 1 month later, summer had settled over Yellowstone National Park. Wildflowers covered the open meadows, and the forests were alive with birdsong once again. Visitors filled the hiking trails, unaware of how close the park had come to losing so many of its wild residents. Life had finally returned to normal. Daniel Brooks guided his green National Park Service pickup along a familiar patrol road with Max sitting proudly in the passenger seat. It felt just like any other morning. Yet both of them knew things had changed. As they drove past the clearing where the abandoned cargo truck had once been hidden, there was no trace of what had happened. The truck was gone. The hidden camp had been dismantled. The forest had already begun reclaiming every scar left behind. Nature always found a way to heal. Daniel smiled. I guess this place finally has some peace. Max looked out the open window, letting the cool mountain breeze ruffle his fur. A few miles later, Daniel stopped beside a quiet overlook above a wide valley. He climbed out of the truck with Max close behind. Together they stood in silence, listening to the wind moving through the pine trees. Then a familiar cry echoed across the sky. Daniel looked up. A young bald eagle soared overhead. Its powerful wings carried it effortlessly above the valley. The bird circled once, then again, before flying lower over Daniel and Max. For a brief moment, it seemed to pause directly above them. Max wagged his tail. The eagle gave one final call before climbing higher into the bright blue sky and disappearing beyond the mountains. Daniel smiled. I think that was our friend. He gently scratched behind Max's ears. You helped give her a second chance. His radio suddenly crackled. Ranger Brooks, we've received a report of hikers needing assistance near Canyon Trail. Daniel picked up the microphone. Copy that. We're on our way. He looked down at Max. Ready for another adventure, the German Shepherd stood immediately, his ears perked and his tail wagging with excitement. Daniel laughed. I'll take that as a yes. Moments later, the green pickup rolled back onto the winding forest road. The morning sun filtered through the towering pines as Daniel and Max disappeared deeper into Yellowstone. Some heroes wear a badge, others have 4 paws, and an incredible instinct to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Because one loyal German Shepherd refused to ignore an abandoned truck hidden deep in the forest. More than 100 wild animals were rescued. A massive wildlife trafficking network was destroyed, and countless lives were given a second chance. For Daniel, Max was more than a partner. He was family. And as long as they patrolled the forest together, Yellowstone would always have 2 guardians watching over its wilderness. Their greatest adventure had come to an end, but somewhere beyond the next bend in the trail, another one was already waiting.